I'm not a man. Documents that shows something interesting in many ways. Are, as you know, dispatches. These are from the official reports. Messages sent from the Secretary of War, General in Chief Halleck, and then the officer Wool, who was in charge of the Department of the East. He was the oldest general, some of you probably know this, on either side during the Civil War, and retired from service right after this. He'd been active in the Army since the War of 1812.
Hadn't he been down at Fort Monroe?
He had. I think he'd helped secure Fort Monroe at the time. So let's try and tease some meaning out of these. What did these military, these officers seem to be particularly concerned about the causes of the riots? Do they go into great detail about the causes? Do they look at issues like class? Do they look at how do they, and then the second part, maybe how do they seem to be responding? Because they respond in a bunch of different ways.
Well, initially I saw it as being a typical pissing contest over who had the appropriate authority, the commission.
So
General Brown refused to follow any orders from General Sanford, and
so you get there's this, and this even happens this isn't an isolated, you probably know, and this even happened in the midst of battles sometimes when you had generals debating whose commission was senior to another officer. And both of these men are probably, this is a guess on my part, both Brown and Wool are too old for active field service at this point in their career. Wool was born in 1784, Harvey Brown in 1795, but they're still in active service. They have long, distinguished careers in earlier conflicts, and so they've been put in charge of these posts. But I just have to wonder if the dispute between Brown and Sanford had any kind of impact on how federal authorities were responding. What else struck you in particular about the response of
It seemed like nobody really wanted to declare martial law. That's what needed to happen, but it wasn't happening. I just wondered what kind of a role Wool played in that, and why he didn't want to do it, and why the governor didn't want to do it. It's like they thought the other one was supposed to do it or something.
The Democrat. Right. The governor.
New York politics.
The governor of New York at this time, Horatio Seymour, was both a Democrat and he was opposed to conscription. So he was not about to declare martial law. In fact, he would have preferred the federal authorities not be there in the first place.
Police. They didn't have enough policemen and they couldn't control it.
Right. There's far too
difficult too.
Far too police.
They tried to integrate an approach with the military and the police going out and doing patrols.
Exactly.
and you had the sailors having to secure the forts while the garrisons of the forts were brought in.
Right, good. So they're bringing in the garrisons at Governor's Island, Fort Hamilton. They're calling all of those regulars, as they refer to them, into the city.
But didn't Wool complain that he really didn't have troops to start with because they'd all been shipped out because of Gettysburg, really?
Right, not just regulars, but also the New York State Militia.
And then transportation became an issue, coming back from the battlefield after Gettysburg, looking at New Jersey, where are these people? You know, and we're contacting, you know, the Secretary of War, and it's getting worse, and it's getting worse, and it's moving in different places around the city, around Manhattan, even to Brooklyn and Staten Island. I mean,
do they seem to be concerned that it's going to keep spreading?
At first he says, "Oh, we'll get it taken care of by tomorrow." And then the next day, "Oh, we'll get it taken care of by tomorrow." And it just got worse and worse.
It'll be done soon.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's one passage there, concern it's going to spread to adjoining counties. And by that, some of you probably have a far better grasp of New York geography than I do. I've been there a few times. But by that, does he mean like...
He would mean the different neighborhoods, different boroughs of New York. And at that time, Brooklyn wasn't part of New York City.
Okay, that's right. Okay. So that's what he's referring to.
Yeah, so, and eventually it did go to Staten Island and did go to Brooklyn and did deal with, a lot of thousands of people. And what I thought was interesting, even without the control of, suppressing this violence, they even looked to, the Catholic Church, played a role. Eventually the Catholic Church is trying to help out. I mean, there were just so many different groups, the wealthy, who were dealing with, big business, the Irish,
Is there any mention whatsoever in here, though, of discriminating between different types of rioters and different goals? While in fact, the best booklet study.
Here's a booklet study
This booklet study by Ivor Bernstein.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, you have?
I took a class in Southern Illinois. I think it was from St. Louis.
Yeah.
But his book was his doctoral thesis.
And there's
It's very good.
That I might do.
Many different ways.
Many different ways to put out. He didn't start off as a draft riot, but then it was something else.
Some people helping the one. But the riots, the one thing about the riots that got more from Ivor Bernstein and General Wool, you mentioned, about other reasons. You're in the Industrial Revolution and the war, and these people are working 60 to 80 hours with virtually no pay, and they were also worried about African Americans, the emancipation, taking their jobs, and they're Confederate sympathizers, or at least some of the big business bankers were, and they want to try to find a way to have a smaller workforce and better wages.
And what is the Republican Party symbolize to a lot of these New York Democrats, to a lot of these Irish Catholics? What is it that they don't like about the Republican Party?
Control. Reform.
Okay, there's religious differences, but it's also
They care more about blacks than they care about
exactly. It's a party of emancipation. New York had the most fluid labor market in the country at that time, so you have huge numbers of laborers, day laborers, and the last thing on earth they want is to be competing with floods of freedom.
Well, just one quick point on that. There's an expression with the N-word, N-work. That came about because those were the jobs that blacks traditionally held. They were the barbers, they were the butchers, because they were dirty jobs that the person's considered demeaning. But these were the jobs that the immigrants saw as their entry step. So it's not that the blacks are taking their jobs, the immigrants are taking the black jobs. But now there's more blacks coming in. So there's a turnabout in that particular situation.
A lot of the targets of the mobs after the first day were businesses that were like interracial clientele, particularly down along the docks. So bars, brothels, boarding houses, anyone who had catered, any whites who catered to black customers became targets of the mob.
And then any Republican affiliated.
Right. The Horace Greeley's the Tribune, one of the most supported papers in the country. Greeley is personally targeted.
Wasn't the police chief?
The police chief was beaten severely on the first day of the riot. Kennedy.
Was she a Democrat? But it had been Democrat right before.
It had been Fernando Wood who wanted to secede himself.
Tammany, the Democrats, he's walking this fine line.
They switch on the second day, though. They were the first day. Tammany was like, "Oh yeah, let's go for it," and then they flip when it looks like it's going to be to their benefit.
Right, and then the whole thing about bringing the community to help pay for bounties. To help
That's
poor
Tammany's
people
solution,
to
right?
pay for bounties and stuff.
So if your name gets
Didn't raise
called,
like $40,000.
Tammany will step in and pay the commutation fee.
The first day, they weren't really all Irish though either.
Right.
That's a big point. That's something that first time.
So
Who
when it
is it?
switches, you see Tammany switch as well, because it becomes more Irish. There are a lot of non-Irish
Right.
involved.
It's artisans, it's Protestants, and they're, on the first day, the 13th, a lot of the protests are directed solely at the provost marshal and the draft.
Changes in economic
Exactly.
and ethnic nationalistic. A lot of changes.
Bernstein said the German Americans flipped too. They were in the first day. They were all there, and then they said, "No."
They back off, and then they're about law and order.
German Americans, if you remember, at this point in time coming in are going to be primarily Catholic also. There's a German community split, there's two parts. There's those which have been here for a while, and then they say around 1830 they draw a dividing line. Say after that time, those who are coming in primarily were Catholic and from a different portion of Germany. So even with, you can't talk about the German community as being cohesive. It's really two quite distinct groups, with one being assimilated, which are generally referred to as Yankee or Pennsylvania Germans. And when they use the term German American, that's used for the new immigrants, which came in two ways, one from 1830 and the other around 1848.
Since the revolution. Sure.
They were the losers of revolution getting out for their lives.
Right.
In 48.
Yes.
One of the officers who's mentioned a number of times, I think was given command of all the regulars, all the volunteers, Robert Nugent. And, right, so he's the provost, but he's put, the War Department chose him specifically for a couple of reasons. They were trying to be smart about this. It didn't stop the riots, but that name kind of stuck in my head because about 12 years ago, and for 10 years prior to that, I was a seasonal park service historian at Fredericksburg. And I said, I vaguely remember this name. And then when I looked at it, oh, there it is. Yeah, he's colonel of the 69th New York. So the War Department purposely placed in charge a Democrat and an Irishman of decorated, someone who'd been wounded in battle, hoping, of course, that the Irish would identify with him, but he's the officer who's supposed to carry out the draft.
Just one other quick point here. Heard that the Irish were really against the draft because they had turned against fighting the war with what had happened at Antietam and at Fredericksburg. That basically they felt there would be lambs led to slaughter to get no benefit from it.
That and emancipation.
Gettysburg doesn't help anyone when they see this list of all these casualties coming in. They're thinking that's them.
Because of the past history that's set up. So there's several other factors which are strongly giving them a shove which way to go.
Economic, just like today. Jobs.
They also overlooked the fact that because of the Emancipation Proclamation, you now had black soldiers serving, which meant less of them went to be drafted.
But the Irish basically were not enlisting like they had been, which is one of the reasons you have the conscription come in. You're getting fewer and fewer replacements. Before, they're being met at the ships, coming in and being signed up, and that now they hear the stories, the veterans are back there, and they're telling them, hey, you don't want to get into this. So,
They're missing out.
a person talking, that can be very persuasive.
But in the end, less than 10% of the guys that got drafted served anyway. It's like more like around 7%. Ever actually got drafted actually served.
But you have to respond in what you know at the time.
Right.
Let's talk for a few minutes about gangs. How many of y'all have seen gangs? Okay, good. Even my students have a fairly large percentage have seen it. And it is. I like it a lot. But there's a lot. I think it's Martin Scorsese's vision.
Revision.
Artistic revision. Right. And so let's talk about it.
But you know, during the riots, many people in 5 points in the area you're talking about didn't participate.
Exactly.
They stayed away. And they had some businesses, like you said, that did have a small clientele, you know, that dealt with African Americans. So that's kind of surprising from one point of view.
You look at it, and it's inverse. I mean, you look at maps of where African Americans were killed or where the worst violence took place. I think, for instance, there were only 3 of all the people arrested during the riots. There were only 3 from the 5 police stations. So that wasn't where the violence was taking place. What else about the movie? If you're critiquing it, it seems
They showed early in the movie, like you guys talked about, when they came off the boat and said you can become a citizen, you can get sold, you know, very quickly, just go right into the war, here's your uniform, okay, bye.
And you get paid.
Yeah, and you'll get paid. You'll be a citizen. You know, and look at, by comparing it to today with the immigration that they talk about. You know, about 15 years or whatever. So that was a positive at one time.
She has been raised in the upper crust.
A lot of violence.
I thought the part where they were shelling New York was rather ridiculous. It was exciting climactic to the movie, but that didn't happen.
It makes no sense at all.
Although in the orders,
Well, the
he says
boats-
if you feel you need to fire on Wall or Pine Street, go ahead.
So
But they didn't.
Well, no, they
That's
didn't.
what
but-
struck me when I read these for the first time. It's like, gosh, I mean, that was a crazy, over-the-top scene, but
Well, they have
the
strikes.
Navy or the War Department was at least thinking of that as their possibility.
They had the authorization to do it.
Yes, sir, exactly. Firing on the wall.
Gunboat captains, when you're ordered to.
Yes.
Think about that was as bad as that in some respects is a major battle. You know, there was so much violence here in the north between Union citizens. And they, you know, while there weren't as many deaths, there was plenty of casualties and violence, and burning of property, and then of course that could have spread. Will it? You know, what is it?
Well, they're forcing to be playing down. They're giving these rather, I would find, significant numbers, and they're sort of saying, you know, there were only that many that were being killed and wounded. And then there's more of an emphasis, then they get very specific with the numbers, and they say, here's how many soldiers were killed and wounded.
Is there? You think there was a lot of censorship? It doesn't talk about it, but do you think in the newspapers?
The press was so partisan, remember. I think you could probably read Republican newspapers and get one version of events and read Democratic or East Democratic newspapers, and it would have
Southerners knew about this.
Oh, very much.
They knew about this, and they're going, "I told you so, I told you so," and they're hopeful that it wouldn't spread in that war of attrition, that they would be able to break the union.
You know, it's been interesting to have read. You know, like in one of the Miss Lusty, you know, was talking this afternoon about Richmond and riots, and then after Gettysburg, what they said in the newspapers. It would have been interesting to do some research and find some accounts in southern newspapers on what happened, you know, and that could have been a rallying cry. If you think about it, here, we lost Vicksburg, Gettysburg, but look at what's happening in New York.
Maybe it'll strengthen the Copperheads.
I was going to say, wasn't that a major factor that there was a fear about so many Copperheads being in New York?
Exactly. I mean, it had been there'd been strong Southern sympathies in New York City during the secession crisis.
Yeah, Fernando Wood wanted to secede himself, form an
They
independent
wanted
city.
to secede along with the Confederacy,
Yeah, even from
because there
New
was
York.
such a port for cotton.
Right, exactly.
So New York
it's
City was at least talking about that
And
early.
who held held the paper money in the banks that for the next year's cotton crop.
Well, there was a lot of talk about that.
Was there any similar kind of thing in the South on a smaller scale to resist the draft?
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, think of Bernstein makes this point. A lot of what's the single most invasive government policy of the Civil War? Invasive in terms of individual households. It's conscription. I mean, what could disrupt the household more so than conscription? So, this is the most famous incident. But there are draft riots in Milwaukee among German Americans in the tier counties outside of Milwaukee. There are some in other Midwestern cities. There's a great book on labor unrest in the Pennsylvania coal fields. So this is the biggest and certainly the most famous, rightfully so, draft riot, but it's not the only one. Smaller scales, huge numbers of Joan Cashin has written a really good essay, I don't have the title, but about resistance to the draft in the North. And it manifests itself in different ways. I mean, there are huge numbers, just like in Vietnam, of men going to Canada. I think Pete mentioned that.
Robert E. Lee, one of the reasons many, going to Gettysburg to try to win the war, because he knows he can't go on forever, and men and economics play a significant role. But that must, after losing Gettysburg, or that's probably, he had hoped he won Gettysburg and those types of things would happen. And then bring public opinion and government to end the war. Right. So on those types of things, you win the battle, but you lose the war. And that's what he's definitely hoping for.
He's keenly aware of northern politics.
Here's a question for you. Were there spies or people coming up from the South to try to antagonize certain groups to riot?
Or do certain things? South had a number of persons coming down from Canada.
Sure.
There's a lot of Southern sympathizers in New York.
Yes, there were. Sure.
I think the term Greek fire.
Right. Yeah. There have been some articles about that.
I wonder if they held that along, some of the unions and businesses, and, the hatred of African American racism.
I'm not sure a lot of New Yorkers needed that much encouragement, to be honest. But yeah, there's widespread draft resistance in the South too.
They had it a year earlier.
What's that?
Theirs was a year earlier.
Right, they've been, exactly. So it's April 62.
And they had more professional exemptions than saw in the North.
Ways for the privilege to get out.
Yeah. Same thing was happening in the Pennsylvania Appalachian Mountains.
Yes, sir.
And the Boston Draft Riot was a day, but that was about the same time too. So there was a lot of discussion about drafts. It just got carried away with New York City.
What's interesting about this, when I read the Bernstein book, and I read another book called something
Damn Yankees?
No. It was about the riots. But at any rate, the thing that struck me was, as a child of the 60s, the resistance to martial law, declaring martial law, and just going in and taking care of business. And especially in New York City.
Putting your teams.
Yeah, it does. The resistance to, let's go in here, and they have the regulars, and we'll take care of this. There's certainly resistance to declaring martial law in the state and the city.
And those kinds of things, and very active.
I kind of got a sense that maybe they were afraid to declare they were.
That Seymour could say, now Abe Lincoln's invading my state.
The Lincoln administration very purposefully, after the riots, did not declare martial law because they were worried it would just inflame tensions even more.
Look how many people were involved.
Thousands.
Big area. New York's a big place.
And they were really vicious too. It wasn't like they were throwing rocks through windows or stealing things. They were hanging and they were mutilating, and that was
Burning buildings.
Right, burning the orphanage.
yeah.
They were literally going to people's homes and dragging them
Drag 'em
out.
out.
Well, that's like the American Revolution. We did the same thing then too.
Right.
I mean, it's part of
I've always thought that was something that women did.
I wonder if we can go back to General Wool for a second. He kind of got blamed, didn't he, for not doing a very good job here? But just reading his telegrams, it seems like he was trying to do a good job.
Ask for help.
Yeah, and getting help.
What few resources he had.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine. I mean, I tried to read a little bit about his professional career. You know, he fought the British, he fought Seminoles, he fought
the Mexicans.
He never had to deal with an enormous insurgency in American cities.
Maybe he was too old.
Yeah.
I had to go to better camp.
That's what everybody said. They said he was too old, he was incompetent, but I don't feel he was incompetent. I think he was doing.
He's trying to get clear lines of authority set up, resolve all those particular difficulties, trying to get the troops in from wherever they can get the resources together.
And could he have been better prepared? He can't be prepared for that. I mean, could you have had intelligence?
Could you have
before it
He didn't have
occurred?
the manpower. They'd all been
Right.
stripped. So how could he be prepared?
No.
Plus, you had a multitude of officers arriving, taking command of all different things. You have Canby arriving. You have these officers from the fort. You have Kilpatrick volunteering.
No, there are too many chiefs and not enough Indians.
When you look at it from a logistical side of it, knowing about New York City, these places are quite a ways apart, and there's no easy way to connect or move troops or anything like that. It's terrible now. It was really bad then, you know, and so you really couldn't. Oh yeah, I mean,
They fortified certain things, like the armories. They fortified certain armories. And much of that,
That's City
much
Hall.
of that is based in Sanford.
But look what they're doing. They're giving those guarding the armies 20 rounds. They're giving 60 rounds, or was it 40 or 60, to those that are going out. I found that rather strange that they're not putting equal at least.
And then bring in the artillery to at certain points of the armories to keep. And Wool makes a big point about how many weapons he
Confiscated.
Yeah, confiscated.
And kind of the ingenious ways that some of the rioters were trying, I thought at least, hide weapons.
That was creative. There must have been a lot of that. In
yeah, probably. Kind of like that trail last night.
Yes,
Are you going to reach in and get that revolver?
yeah.
Check that for guns.
And being from, usually it was a police matter. And the police in New York City were the best ones. There weren't enough of them. They certainly did their job. They tried to do their job.
They weren't really successful.
But they
At least in the first few days.
no one was. But I think the police, when they try to move them to different areas and try to find and concentrate them, the police in New York City, and when you look at New York City Police Department before that, who are these guys? But these guys were really concerned, and they did their job. They did a good job. The police in other cities make not do a good job.
Well, what was the composition of police at this time? Because at what point did they shift over to being large numbers of Irish in police? That was later on. That was past this. So
later on.
So then there would be some animosity now of the police officers because these are a different. Well, I can take the British answer. The Irish were savages. They're British.
The police, it's not just their stations that are being attacked. I mean, it's their homes.
Their homes,
So
their families.
clearly the rioters knew, police knew. Sometimes like senses they would just attack somebody who was well dressed.
People who helped.
Also, only having one police force in New York was relatively new at this point. In the 1850s, there were separate police forces for the mayor's office. He had his own police, and then the city had a police force.
Yes,
and they would battle each other.
Scene or two in gangs in
Like
New
the
York
fire-
that bring that out.
like
Just
the
At one point, Mayor Wood was being arrested by the city police, and the mayor's police was in City Hall fighting them off.
Bernstein talks about how I think it's one fire department on the first day that instigates things by burning down or trashing of the provost marshal office.
But that's going into the tradition of fire companies, that you had independent companies.
Exactly.
They were raced to be the first one out of fire and stop the fight off anyone trying to beat them there. So you really did not have a cooperative, cohesive system for fighting fires in any urban city.
Any urban city at that time. Yeah.
That's another thing I liked about Scorsese's film is he kind of illustrates that scenes, the competition among volunteer fire companies.
A lot of them didn't come back.
Within what do you think is the main significance of the draft riots? Why are they worth remembering? I mean, one of the things I think that Bernstein says is that there was collective amnesia in New York. No one wanted to claim the riots, right? Certainly organized labor didn't, because there's the overtones of treason. I mean, you're rising up against the federal government, so organized labor after the Civil War didn't want to be associated with that. They didn't particularly want to be associated with anti-black sentiments. The Irish tried to distance themselves from it. The city leaders, the reading back of the Civil War and the memory of the Civil War in the North was one where people wanted to see the country as united. Right? So this is an embarrassment.
But what about old money, big business bankers who, after playing both sides, ended up raising money for the African American, what were they?
The Union leaders.
Yeah, 40, 50,000, and then fielded some black regiment and had a parade later. So they try to show, no, it's okay. Everybody's welcome here, even though they weren't.
I mean, New York had a huge abolitionist press, but it also had a huge copperhead anti-black press.
But there's a strong tie-in, such a strong tie-in economically with the South.
Right.
Well, your comment about trying to show everyone coming together runs counter to the we were an extremely racist society at the time. We couldn't find enough ways to split down and divide groups. So that's, if I was living at the time, I would find that really pretentious, knowing what's going on. Looking back now, we would accept an explanation like that, but it doesn't wash.
And one thing that's not mentioned during the draft riots, there had been in the, 10, 15 years before then, a handful of riots in New York City.
Right.
Not as large, of course, but they had their history.
Yeah, the scale is one of the different things. There have been the anti-Irish. I mean, Philadelphia too.
The wolf packs that they were talking about, I guess, during the 70s and 80s in Philadelphia are nothing new. 1850s, they had wolf packs running through the city, large groups of younger individuals robbing and beating up individuals in the streets.
That leads to my question. So how much of this was ideologically driven, hate the draft, and how much of it was really opportunistic? Because it keep mentioning in Bernstein, men and boys, and they would go around and beg they'd go to a bar and say, tell me you're on our side, then give us a round of drinks, and then they go to the next bar. That's pretty opportunistic as well.
Or plundering.
Yeah. So what do you think the percentage was?
Sounds like protection.
Well, yeah, today has a union.
It goes on today too.
Yeah.
Don't you get a sense from Bernstein that it's both? That there are complex motives for these riots?
Because it seems to come up in every riot. There's always this element of, hey, let's just go out and have a good time, and it's usually younger people and it's taking advantage.
He points out that after the first day, there are a lot of artisans, middle class, people who value law and order in the city, but they're really opposed to the draft. And when things start to get more and more out of hand, and they don't want to kill blacks, when the plundering gets worse, when the killings, that's when they switch sides. And apparently a lot of the fire companies too. So by the second day of the draft, or excuse me, the second day of the riots, the fire companies are siding with the police.
What about the unions forcing businesses to be shut down? You won't open.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah, so on the first day, right?
Or will burn your business down.
So it's about shutting down workers. It's like a strike. This is the earliest stages of organized labor in the U.S., as a lot of y'all know. So it's in its infancy.
Another point is they did arrest people. They did charge people. But the sentencing was so light.
Well, that's a very good example.
Yeah, it's about, you guys, this really didn't happen, it didn't happen so bad, we'll let you go. Reconciliation. Yeah, this really didn't happen. We won't send you to jail.
Not so much, I don't think sectional reconciliation, but reconciliation across class lines and ethnic and party and political party lines. Right. Anyone have any final, I think we're supposed to do
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. No, this is impressive. Y'all.
And you were able to finish your food on your plate.
No, I enjoyed it.
Very well done.
Good discussion.
The only guy probably.
Oh, it's a good movie.